What happens when the most heavily armed fortress in Europe cannot find fuel for its own tanks? What happens when a governor has to fly to Moscow and beg the Kremlin for gasoline just to keep buses running on the street? Before we go further, if this story grips you the way it should, do something small for us right now. Tap that like button like you're closing a door on the algorithm's face. Subscribe if you want the next chapter delivered straight to you. And drop one word, just one, in the comments below. That single word tells the algorithm real humans are watching, and that keeps this channel alive. Now let's talk about Kaliningrad. For decades, this small patch of land squeezed between Poland and Lithuania was supposed to be Russia's fist in Europe. Nuclear-capable missiles, air defense systems, a naval fleet base, a permanent reminder to NATO that Moscow could reach deep into the Baltic whenever it wanted. That was the plan. That was the image the Kremlin built and rebuilt for 30 years. An image designed to make Europe nervous every single time it looked at a map. But images crack. And in the summer of 2026, this one shattered in the most humiliating way possible. Not with an invasion, not with a single missile fired at it, with something far more embarrassing for a nuclear superpower. An empty gas tank. Picture this. Lines of cars stretching for blocks. People waiting for hours just to buy a few liters of gasoline. Buses stuck because there's no diesel to run them. Farmers watching their fuel bills triple overnight. This isn't footage from some distant war zone. This is happening inside Russia's own territory, in a region ringed by NATO countries, in the middle of a modern year, 2026. The region's governor, a man named Alexei Besprozvanik, had to travel to Moscow and personally ask Vladimir Putin for emergency fuel shipments. Think about what that means. A governor doesn't fly to the capital to beg for gasoline unless the situation back home has already spiraled past his control. Putin approved the request, but approval on paper doesn't refill a fuel tank overnight, and the lines kept growing anyway, block after block, day after day. Here's the twist that makes this story so strange, almost unbelievable if you didn't have the footage in front of you. Ukraine did this without sending a single soldier across the border, without a naval blockade, without declaring war on this region at all. Using drones that cost a few $1,000s each, cheaper than the car many of us drive to work, Ukraine has managed to choke a fortress the West spent decades trying to counter through diplomacy and military posturing, and never quite managed to touch. So how exactly did a handful of cheap flying machines bring one of Russia's most fortified regions to its knees? To understand that, we need to go back to geography, because geography is the real villain and the real hero of this entire story. Kaliningrad is not connected to mainland Russia. It never has been, not in any simple way. It sits alone, surrounded by Poland to the south, Lithuania to the north, and the Baltic Sea to the west. Before World War II, this land belonged to Germany and was known as Königsberg. After the war, the Soviets took it, emptied it of its German population, and turned it into a heavily fortified military outpost. That identity never really left, and traces of it still whisper through the architecture today. Today, it hosts the headquarters of Russia's Baltic Fleet, along with Iskander missile batteries, S-400 air defense systems, and electronic warfare units. On paper, this was supposed to be untouchable, a fortress within a fortress. But after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, something changed. Lithuania and Poland, both NATO and EU members, tightened restrictions on goods moving by rail and road into Kaliningrad. The overland routes that once kept the region supplied became narrower and narrower with every passing year. That left only one real option to keep the exclave alive: the sea. Everything Kaliningrad needs, fuel, ammunition, food, industrial materials, now has to travel roughly 1,500 kilometers by ship from ports near St. Petersburg all the way across the Baltic Sea. That's the artery. That's the single thread keeping over 1 million civilians, along with tens of thousands of soldiers, connected to the rest of Russia. And here's the part that should terrify any military strategist studying this in real time. When your entire electricity, heating, industry, and defense system depends on one sea route, you don't need to attack the fortress itself. You just need to touch the artery feeding it. That is exactly what Ukraine figured out. And once they figured it out, they went after it with surgical precision. In early June 2026, long-range Ukrainian drones struck the Kronstadt shipyard, the beating heart of Baltic Fleet repair and maintenance. In a single night, roughly 5,000 tons of ammunition were destroyed. Picture that scale for a second. That's not one warehouse. That's the equivalent of hundreds of train cars packed full of ammunition, gone before it ever reached the front, before it ever reached Kaliningrad's own defenses. But that strike wasn't a one-off event. It was one piece of a much larger, coordinated campaign that had been building for months. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, Ukrainian drones systematically targeted Russian oil refineries across the country, hitting close to 18 major facilities and crippling their output one by one. Russia, one of the largest energy exporters on the planet, found itself in the humiliating position of having to import gasoline from abroad while banning its own exports of diesel and jet fuel just to keep domestic supply from collapsing entirely. Nationwide gasoline production fell by roughly a quarter within a single year. This wasn't just a Kaliningrad problem anymore. It became a nationwide crisis, touching close to 2/3 of Russia's regions. But Kaliningrad, sitting at the very end of the supply chain, always gets whatever is left over after Moscow, and the big cities take their share first. When the whole system is starving, the most distant limb starves fastest and hardest. And Ukraine wasn't finished there. They also went after the port infrastructure that feeds Kaliningrad's sea lane directly. In early June, drones struck one of the Baltic's largest oil terminals near St. Petersburg, sending black smoke over the skyline during an economic forum Putin himself was hosting at that exact moment. Weeks later, they hit the same area again. Every strike on that terminal is a strike on the very artery keeping Kaliningrad's lights on, its buses running, its soldiers fed. So think about the full picture now, all at once. A region entirely dependent on one sea route for survival. That sea route's departure point under repeated drone attack, refineries across the country crippled, cutting the fuel supply at its source before it even reaches a ship. And a naval repair yard smashed, meaning even the vessels meant to protect that sea route are struggling to stay combat ready. None of this required an invasion. None of this required NATO to send a single tank across a border. It required patience, precision, and an understanding that modern warfare isn't only about capturing land anymore. It's about cutting the threads that keep a place alive, one thread at a time, until the whole structure starts to sway. If you're starting to see how these pieces connect, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for. Before we go deeper into how far this actually reaches, take 3 seconds and hit that subscribe button, because the next part of this story links Kaliningrad's crisis to something happening across the entire Baltic region, and it changes how you'll see this whole conflict. Now let's talk about why Kaliningrad's isolation is even deeper than most people realize, because fuel is only half of this story. Back in February 2025, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania made a historic decision. They disconnected from the old Soviet-era shared power grid and synchronized instead with continental Europe's electrical network. For decades, Kaliningrad had been able to lean on the shared grid during emergencies, pulling extra power from its Baltic neighbors when needed. That safety net vanished overnight. Lithuania went further, physically dismantling the high-voltage transmission lines running along the Kaliningrad border. There was no equipment left connecting the two grids at all, nothing to fall back on. Kaliningrad became, in the truest sense of the word, an energy island. To cope, the region now relies almost entirely on its own internal power plants, natural gas turbines mostly, plus a coal plant kept on standby just in case. And where does the natural gas for those turbines come from? Either an overland pipeline through Lithuania, which is already heavily restricted, or a floating liquefied natural gas terminal that depends entirely on ships crossing that same fragile 1,500-kilometer stretch of open water that Ukrainian drones and naval strikes have turned into one of the most dangerous shipping corridors in Europe. So think about what's really happening here. Hospitals, water pumps, heating systems, home refrigerators, all of it hangs on LNG tankers, making it safely across the sea, where Ukrainian forces are actively hunting Shadow Fleet vessels and striking naval escorts sitting helpless in dry dock. Insurance premiums for ships willing to make that crossing have shot up dramatically because insurers know exactly how risky that water has become. You don't need to bomb a power plant directly if you can simply make it too expensive and too dangerous for anyone to bring it fuel in the first place. And this pressure isn't only coming from the sea, it's tightening from the land and the sky too, on every side at once. 9 NATO countries now effectively encircle Kaliningrad: Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Germany. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the Baltic Sea has essentially become an alliance-controlled body of water. The strategically vital island of Gotland has been reinforced with heavy weapons. Swedish fighter jets now regularly scramble to intercept Russian aircraft that stray too close to Allied airspace. On the ground, in mid-June 2026, Lithuania, Poland, and France ran a massive joint military exercise centered directly on the Suwałki Gap, the narrow 65-kilometer strip of land that is Kaliningrad's only theoretical land connection toward Belarus, and by extension, mainland Russia. Thousands of Allied troops practiced defending and implicitly cutting off this corridor within moments if a crisis ever demanded it. The message to Moscow was not subtle. If it ever came to that, this land bridge could be severed almost instantly, leaving Kaliningrad with nothing but the sea. Poland has also transformed its military posture dramatically, bringing in advanced fifth-generation stealth fighters capable of operating below the detection threshold of Kaliningrad's own air defense systems. Hundreds of kilometers of border fortifications are going up along the frontier. Estonia has activated an early version of a continent-scale anti-drone shield. New long-range cruise missile programs are being developed specifically to close the gap in reach across the region, extending the threat radius further than ever before. Put all of this together, and you get a picture that would have sounded like fiction just a few years ago. A fortress that was designed to threaten Europe now sits surrounded, its supply lines cut thin, its energy grid isolated, its sea route under constant harassment, and its own governor pleading with Moscow for basic fuel, just to keep the lights on and the buses moving. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment, something that gets lost in all the strategic talk. The people living inside Kaliningrad are not simply extras in a geopolitical drama. They are families standing in gas lines for hours in the summer heat. They are farmers watching diesel prices climb past what they can afford, wondering if this year's harvest will even reach the market. They are hospital staff, worrying quietly about backup power failing at the worst possible moment. Whatever side of this conflict you're watching from, it's worth remembering that ordinary people always absorb the real cost of these strategic games, long before any government official ever feels it themselves. There's also a quieter, more human layer to this story that doesn't get talked about enough. Kaliningrad has always had a strange, in-between identity. Geographically, it sits far closer to Warsaw and Vilnius, even Berlin, than it does to Moscow. Traces of its old German history, cathedrals, architecture, street layouts still linger beneath the Soviet, rebuilding, refusing to fully disappear. Russian officials have openly worried, on the record, about what they call a creeping regional identity that leans more European than Russian. When a government is nervous enough about an identity to shut down cultural organizations over it, that tells you the identity is real, even if most residents still say, when surveyed, that they feel strongly Russian and have no plans to leave. But cracks are showing among the younger generation. Surveys conducted by Russian researchers themselves found that a meaningful share of young people in Kaliningrad want out, not necessarily toward Europe, but toward Moscow and St. Petersburg, chasing better opportunities and higher living standards than this isolated corner can offer them. A fuel crisis, a heating crisis, a growing sense of being forgotten at the edge of the map, all of that only deepens that quiet restlessness. Nobody is staging a revolt here, but something is shifting beneath the surface, slowly, and Moscow knows it, even if it won't say so out loud. We're about halfway through this story, and honestly, the deeper layer is still ahead. If this kind of grounded, fact-first breakdown is what you come here for, let this video earn your subscription. Not because we're asking twice, but because the next section connects this local crisis to a much bigger global pattern, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. Now let's step back and look at why this matters far beyond one exclave on the Baltic coast. For years, the assumption in military planning was simple. If you want to neutralize a fortified region, you need an army, a navy, and actual assault, something loud and visible that triggers a formal war. What's happening in Kaliningrad rewrites that assumption completely. This is a slow, quiet siege. No declaration of war, no invasion, no dramatic headline moment where tanks roll across a border. Instead, it's refineries burning one by one, ports under repeated drone strikes, insurance markets pricing ships out of a dangerous route, a power grid quietly dismantled by a neighboring country's engineers rather than its soldiers. Each individual piece looks almost mundane on its own. Together, they add up to something that functions exactly like a blockade, without ever officially being called one. And there's a reason military analysts everywhere, not just in Kiev or Moscow, but in Washington, in Beijing, in Taipei, are watching this unfold so closely. This same playbook, cutting fuel lines, cutting power connections, targeting supply ships instead of the fortress itself, is being tested in real time in another isolated Russian-controlled territory too, Crimea. In June 2026, Ukraine ran an almost identical strategy against Crimea. Bridges connecting the peninsula to the mainland were repeatedly struck. Military cargo traffic along key highways dropped by more than 70%. Fuel convoys burned on roadsides in broad daylight. Gas lines formed in cities that hadn't seen shortages like this in years. Air defense systems were picked off one at a time, weakening the umbrella that was supposed to protect everything underneath it. Naval officers reportedly began quietly, moving their own families off the peninsula, without waiting for any official evacuation order, without asking permission from anyone above them. The parallels between Crimea and Kaliningrad are almost eerie when you place them side by side. Both are physically cut off from the Russian mainland. Both depend heavily on sea routes for basic survival. Both host large concentrations of soldiers living alongside civilian populations who never signed up to be caught in the middle of this. Both have energy, systems propped up by outside supply lines that Ukraine has learned very precisely how to interrupt. What Ukraine is proving in Crimea today reads almost like a rehearsal script for what Kaliningrad may face tomorrow, and the reverse is just as true. Lessons learned in one location are clearly being applied to the other within weeks, sometimes days. This has implications that stretch far beyond Eastern Europe. further than most viewers might expect. If a determined, resource-limited military can effectively strangle a heavily fortified, nuclear-capable exclave using nothing but a swarm of cheap drones and precise strikes on supply infrastructure, then every isolated island or peninsula anywhere in the world suddenly looks a lot more vulnerable than it used to. Strategists studying Taiwan's defense posture or tensions in the South China Sea are almost certainly taking careful notes on how this Baltic story unfolds week by week. Now let's return to the Kremlin's side of this, because their response tells its own story, maybe even more than the drone strikes do. Putin publicly downplayed the entire fuel crisis, calling it not critical, and even suggesting that Ukraine's refinery strikes were an attempt to distract from battlefield setbacks. Meanwhile, his own regional governor was flying to Moscow in person to beg for emergency shipments of fuel, along with federal support for extra ferries and flights just to keep goods and people moving in and out of the region. You don't send a governor to personally plead with the president over something trivial. The contrast between the calm public messaging and the desperate private request tells you almost everything you need to know about how serious this situation actually is behind closed doors, no matter what gets said on camera. And this fuel emergency isn't happening in isolation either. It's unfolding alongside a much larger maritime crisis. Reports from earlier in the year described dozens of Russian tankers and cargo ships trapped by ice in the Gulf of Finland, unable to move for weeks, forcing Russia to divert its precious nuclear icebreakers away from Arctic operations, just to try clearing a path near St. Petersburg. Oil export volumes from key terminals dropped by roughly a third compared to the previous year. Combine that with sanctions, with the fuel shortage, with drone strikes on refineries and shipyards, and you start to see a Russia whose logistics network, on land, at sea, and in the air, is being tested from every direction simultaneously, with very few easy fixes left on the table. So where does this leave Kaliningrad going forward? It's important to be honest here and not overstate things, because exaggeration doesn't serve anyone watching this. This is not a military collapse. The region hasn't fallen. Putin did approve additional fuel shipments. Ferries and emergency flights are being arranged. The Russian flag still flies over every building there, and there's no indication that changes anytime soon. What we're witnessing instead is something more gradual, and in some ways more corrosive. Economic strain, psychological erosion, and a steady chipping away at the image of an untouchable fortress. Because that image, the idea that Kaliningrad was Russia's unshakable fist in the Baltic, was always as much a psychological weapon as a military one. It was meant to remind NATO, remind Europe, remind the world that Russia could project power right into the heart of the continent whenever it chose to. That image only works as long as it holds together. Once ordinary people are standing in fuel lines for hours, once soldiers are watching ammunition supplies dwindle, once a governor has to personally beg the president for gasoline, the fortress stops looking untouchable. It starts looking fragile. And fragile is the last word any nuclear power wants, associated with its most heavily armed outpost. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this, one that goes beyond Russia, beyond Ukraine, beyond this particular stretch of Baltic coastline. For most of modern history, the strength of a fortress was measured by the thickness of its walls, the size of its garrison, the power of its weapons. What Kaliningrad is teaching the world right now is that, in this era, strength is measured by something else entirely: the security of your supply line. You can have the most advanced missile systems on the planet sitting inside your borders, but if the fuel truck carrying diesel to your generators can be cut off 1,000 kilometers away, none of those missiles matter very much. A modern fortress isn't only defended by its walls, it's defended by every ship, every pipeline, every refinery, every power line feeding into it from faraway places most people never think about. Ukraine, with a fraction of Russia's military budget, without a navy that can match Russia's Baltic fleet ship for ship, without a single soldier setting foot on Kaliningrad's soil, has managed to expose that vulnerability in the most visible way possible. Not through brute force, but through patience, precision, and a clear understanding of exactly where the weak links in the chain were hiding all along. So here's the real question worth sitting with as this story continues to unfold in real time. Can Russia keep pouring resources into an outpost that grows more expensive and more precarious by the month? Or does Kaliningrad eventually become less of a symbol of strength and more of a symbol of how quickly the ground can shift beneath even the most fortified positions on Earth? One thing is already clear, and it's the part of this story that deserves to be remembered above all the numbers and the maps and the military jargon. An empire's true strength was never really measured by how far its borders stretched. It was always measured by whether it could still feed, fuel, and protect the people living at its most distant edge. Right now, in the summer of 2026, Russia's answer to that question is playing out in real time, in gas lines stretching for blocks, in a governor's desperate trip to Moscow, and in a fortress that was built to intimidate an entire continent, now quietly struggling just to keep its own lights on. What do you think happens next? Does Kaliningrad hold, or does it become the turning point historians point back to years from now? Type your answer in the comments, share this video with someone who needs to understand what's really happening in the Baltic right now, and subscribe if you want to be here for the next chapter of this story as it unfolds. Thank you for watching all the way to the end.